I mentioned this a little bit earlier, you know, sometimes when you drag out an alpha, let me just get out of this wrap mode thing. So yeah, sometimes when you drag out an alpha, if you notice I'm getting fading at the corners, right? Normally, or the way this used to be caused is by this thing called Radial Fade, and sometimes you want Radial Fade, right? Like in the crack situation, I wanted to kind of blur the edges a bit. So if I didn't get enough blurring at the edges, I could do that. So if I switch, let's say, to this thing, you see I get this weird edge, and even if I inverse this, let me just drag this out again. Yeah. So you could try to just go in and maybe increase the Radial Fade to get a bit of a blur or a blend. Actually, let me inverse this again and adjust the contrast on this thing. I think that's good. So yeah, you know, you can play around with this setting, and Radial Fade can kind of help you blur the edges, but in the case of this other alpha, and in the case of most alphas, when you drag them in, they don't have a Radial Fade, they don't have any of this stuff. So let me just reset all of this, right? So sometimes you may see fading at the edges, and yeah, it kind of slipped my mind. This is actually related to the brush itself. So if you notice, the brush has an inner circle and an outer circle, right? So what that basically is what's called the focal shift. It's sort of like, you know, in Photoshop when you've got the hardness slider on just a standard circular brush. The inner circle is 100% alpha. The outer circle is 0%, and there's a gradient fade from inner to outer, and that's in focal shift. So if we actually set the focal shift to -100, now when you drag out the alpha, you see it's consistent throughout. So that's one thing I think I kind of missed in my lectures, and it was a setting I had actually kind of forgotten a bit about, since I haven't done a lot of environment sculpting in a while. So in this case, this is a simple plane. I've divided it to 4 million polys. And if I brush this out, and if you've got a seamless tile, so remember last year in texturing we did seamless tiles. So this, you could do the same kind of photo processing that we did last year. And now when I drag this out, if I hold shift, it should snap to a straight view. And at some point I should get a nice consistent tile, right? And again, like in the Photoshop exercise, yes, Glizette. So that is with a, I basically set the focal shift to -100 on my brush. I loaded an alpha, which has a seamless tile. So those are the two key steps. And then to get the repetition, you have to go into the brush menu, and then there's this thing called wrap mode. Yeah, so wrap mode 4, it usually does a really good quick repetition of tiling. I should really look closely at the numbers, because each number does change how it tiles. So like if I, so let me switch to like a sphere, I guess. I'll try it on a sphere and see what happens. And I'll just make this polymesh and then divide a bunch of times. So yeah, this will repeat, but you see the patterning is a little bit strange, right? So, you know, you could always play, depending on the surface, depending on the object, you may want to play with different numbers in the wrap mode function. I find the higher it goes, the more tiled it gets, so it gets really aggressive. So you may want to just play with that option. Alright, so this is a tile wrap mode of like 3. Again, this thing doesn't really have like UVs or anything, so it may give you some really weird results anyways if you're on an object like this. Another thing I want to mention, which I don't think we had gotten to yet, is so there's symmetry, right? If we hit X in symmetry, it just goes left to right. So let me just adjust the size of this thing, I guess. Initialize. Let's do 30 by 30. There we go. And then I'll make PolyMesh 3D. And if I divide this a bunch of times, right, we got this little capsule. And so, yeah, if we hit symmetry, that's X by default, right? It drags out. Let me just turn off the wrap mode as well. So you've got symmetry left to right. Now what's cool about this is if you click on transform menu, we have this thing called radial symmetry. So it goes around the object on a particular axis. In this case, if I leave it on the X, you'll see it's kind of going around this way, which doesn't make sense. So in many cases, I'm doing it along the Y-axis, which is vertical. So you get radial symmetry this way, which is super cool, right? And you can change the count on this. So if I go to transform, radial count, you can go from, I think the default is 8. You know, maybe you can go around 24 times. Right, so now you can, let's just switch to a damn standard brush. Right, so now I can actually throw in crazy patterns as I go. Right? Super awesome. It's magic, yeah? This is why ZBrush to me is like a purely amazing program. I always say it's made by aliens from the future, right? It's software made by aliens from the future, because it just doesn't make sense that something could be this awesome. So one other thing I wanted to talk about was just sort of this sort of brick house. So, you know, I had shown you guys the surface noise, which is on the other sides, dragging out an alpha on this side. I was playing around with an alpha here, testing my my Radial Fade. And if you notice, the scene is really, really heavy. This thing is 26 million polys, and it's kind of chugging along. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to maybe optimize this. This was, I believe, Dynameshed. Or no, it's actually just subdivided. So one thing I could do, I'm going to just see if I can reconstruct subdivisions. So this is something that's really amazing in ZBrush as well, is that let's say you're working in Maya and you apply a smooth to something, or you have something in smooth preview and it exports, and let's say you didn't want it to be, that smoothing to be permanently part of the mesh. You could bring it into ZBrush and actually rebuild lower and lower subdivisions of the model. So that can actually make your scene really, really light, or your object really light. So I remember in 3D Max, the way 3D Max works is that in order to preview smoothing, you have to apply what's called a turbo smooth. And if you exported the mesh or converted it to something else, it would permanently make that smoothing part of the mesh. So I would often have to bring it into ZBrush and go reconstruct subdivisions. So right now I'm having ZBrush, I think I deleted the lower subdivisions for some reason, so I can actually reconstruct them. So that's one good reason to have organized mesh with divisions. So Dynamesh, you know, it's great, I find, for blocking. It's great for maybe individual smaller props, but at a certain point, you know, you may not be able to get the resolution slider high enough. And now my scene, right, it's a little quicker and easier to deal with, right? I can rotate around this object. So it's when you get to the higher subdivisions that things get slow. So having a divided mesh is actually fairly useful. But I'll show you an example. So let's say this mesh was somewhere in the middle. I'll bring it to like 1.4 million polys. So let's say I didn't have a higher and a lower. What you can do is actually, we'll turn off Dynamesh, we'll make sure divisions are off. There's this third option I alluded to, which is called Decimation Master. So let's just take a look at the poly count right now, right? It's kind of an even grid. Decimation Master is incredibly useful. So what it's ideally used for is really, really high resolution detailed environments or high resolution detailed characters that can't be exported for a video game, for an environment set, or even for 3D printing. Some 3D printers have a memory limit, meaning the file size can't be bigger than 32 megabytes, let's say, for the raw poly count. So this I sometimes use, and I will allow you guys to do this as well, but it's usually kind of a final step or maybe an in-between step. If I'm switching from a regular mesh to Dynamesh, or vice versa, from a heavy Dynamesh to a more regular organized mesh. So what Decimation does, I'm just going to show you this. You go Decimation Master in the Z plugin menu. So Z plugin, Decimation Master. I'm going to delete my cache because I know I did this earlier. Basically, you're going to process the current subtool. So it'll take a few minutes. And basically what it's saying, it's looking at the surface and finding areas that are high detail, where there's a lot of contrast, like bumps and creases and crevices in the surface. And it's going to try to cluster detail and polygons around those areas. And then in other areas that are flatter, it'll just strip out the detail. It'll strip out mesh. And it converts it all basically to triangulated mesh. Now, I've told you guys before, triangulated mesh generally is bad. But this would be one of the exceptions. So when you see a video game and it's got lots of like mountains and rocky terrain and stuff, they'll actually often use something like Decimation Master to strip out the detail to optimize the scene so it doesn't, you know, lag your Xbox or your computer or whatever. So if I go back to Z plugin, nothing technically has happened yet. The poly count, if you notice, is still 1.475 million polys. But what I can do is reduce this to a percentage of the poly count. So if I just tweak the slider a little bit or punch in like 15%, you see now I can get the poly count down from 1.4 million to 442,000. It's in thousands of polys. Or you can establish that number manually as well. So I could say 300,000 polys is what I want to hit, which is roughly 10% of this. So if I say decimate current, you'll see it change the poly count, right? So now all the sort of flatter area has bigger, larger triangles, and the more detailed areas have, right, more clustered triangles in those little crevices and cracks. Right? So oftentimes at a distance you can't really tell that it's been decimated. So again, it's really great for video games when you need to lighten a scene. Let me just undo so I can go back. So that's the original mesh, and this is the Dynamesh. Can you guys see a difference? Not really, right? So that's kind of the beauty and the genius of that. So if you find your scene getting really, really slow, and even if you're hiding parts like a building or one of the props in your set and it's still getting kind of heavy, again, I always save a version. So I'd say version 3 of the scene, and then immediately save version 4, and then do the decimation, because you always want to have at least a base copy of those objects pre-decimation, because once you decimate, it's hard to get that detail back. So yeah, always make sure you're saving versions. Like any of my projects is multiple versions. And what I also want to talk about as well is, so I showed you guys brick walls using alphas. So if you have a seamless tile or a seamless alpha, a seamless image, we can tile that across a wall. But some of you may want something more physical, more real, I guess we could say. So what I'm going to show you guys is something called insert brushes, right? I probably mentioned it last week and a few times before, but if you go B for brush, I for insert, there's a bunch that are already in here. There's an insert, it's called IMM. So an IMM brush it stands for Insert Multi-Mesh. So what that basically means is that when you click on one of these, I'm going to go with the bricks, right? So if I click and drag a brick in here and hold shift, right? That is a brick that's now basically sitting on top of the base of the building. Now, right now, this building is it's masked and the brick is unmasked. So I can keep drawing out new ones, right? I can go across, but that would take forever to do, right? And if you hit M, so this is what the multi-mesh part of the insert multi-mesh is that somebody's basically hand sculpted. I'm not sure how many. It looks like what? 3, 6, 8. So there's 40 custom sculpted bricks in here, right? That somebody sculpted. So you can switch between these and manually place them, but that's kind of boring. It might be nice to replace a brick here or there, let's say, but so you can drag one out, like so. And I'll mention a setting for this as well. So this is an insert brush. If you go into brush, the brush menu, and go to depth, you can actually set this lower into the building, let's say, so it feels more embedded into the base of this structure. So let me undo and drag again, and you'll see this thing actually sits much better into the building, right? So I'm going to keep this thing masked, and I want to show you guys another little tool. So I'm going to just overhang this on the building, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'll overhang this brick, and I want to split this into its own subtool. So a lot of times, when I'm building stuff, I like to kind of isolate things into their own sort of subtool. And each subtool can have its own divisions. One subtool can be Dynamesh, another can be decimated, another can be a regular subdivided mesh. So I'm going to say split unmasked points. So the unmasked points is the brick. Now let's get out of solo for a second so I can see the whole scene. And I sort of mentioned this before, right? ZBrush, it looks really intimidating, especially just looking at the tool palette on the right side. Like Nanomesh, I technically haven't even touched Nanomesh yet. And you see it's its own toolkit with a bunch of settings. But the great thing about ZBrush is that when you go into geometry, like there's a little edge loop tool, there's a little crease section, there's a little clay polish, right? Dynamesh is its own tiny little system. So it's really like one big software with a bunch of little systems. And if they intimidate you, you can stick to just alphas and brushes and sculpting. And if you want to get into some more of the technical stuff, you can do that as well. So the one I wanted to show you is array mesh. So if you wanted to make actual bricks and have that sort of sit into your buildings or on a wall or whatever, we can do what's called an array mesh. So this is kind of like duplicate special in Maya with one key exception. So I'm going to go into array mesh, right? Enable array. So that's on this brick tool that I've got. And then I'm going to offset, I believe, let me see, where is it going? I'm going to make a bunch of repeats as well so I can see what's actually happening with this thing. Okay, so it's going back. So I need to go on the Z axis, I believe. So go across on Z. I guess the negative amount, like so, right? It's pretty cool. So yeah, let me bring the amount down. So it's a little tricky. There's yeah, we want to kind of set the endpoint somewhere along here. So I think I need like minus 17 or minus 17.5, something like that. Minus 17.5 or minus 17. And then I'm going to just take the repeat down there. That's pretty close. So I'll just bump this amount up. Now I'm going to just alter this a little bit in a second. Yeah, minus 18. Yeah, minus 17.5. So it's a little bit of tweaking. Well, what's great about this versus like the Maya duplicate special is that it's live. You see it live and it updates the duplication. Now I've noticed a little quirk. Like you can add duplicates of this by going append new and then duplicating this whole row and putting it down and offsetting it. But I find ZBrush is a little goofy with this. Yeah, what I'm going to do is actually say make mesh. So what this is going to do is actually, instead of keeping this live and editable, it's going to convert that whole row into like one subtool. So now I can, once that's done, I'm going to re-enable array mesh, repeat twice, and I'm going to pull this down on the y-axis like so. And then offset again, just right, so we get the little stacking of the bricks. Then I'm going to say make mesh. So these two rows are now part of one subtool. So if I go back to the subtool, right, this is now this one complete tool. Back to array again. Now I should just simply make, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 copies. And then just simply move it, oops, not on Z, but on Y. Like so. Pretty awesome, right? Now you can see that all my bricks, they're a little bit off. The rotation's a little bit goofy, but I don't necessarily mind that. And then I'll say make mesh, so it's a live, editable, sculptable mesh. Now again, you just have to be careful because you can see the poly counts are getting high, and I think each one of these bricks is like 20, 30, 40,000 polys. So I'll show you how to make my own custom brick, and you may not want something as detailed as this to start with either, because the pattern becomes very obvious very quickly. So I'll show you guys how to make an original custom-made insert brush of your own, a brick, let's say. You could do stone, you can do whatever you want. So in this case, I'm going to turn off perspective, and again, I've kept my building roughly aligned to a left-right XYZ axis, right? So remember, I can go B for brush, trim, because I want to just slice the ends off and have them capped. So I'm going to go trim, curve, and just come across like so. Oh, it's 15 million polys actually. It's going to be quite heavy, so, oh, crash. One thing you got to watch out for. But yeah, what I would basically do is trim that off. If the mesh was too heavy, then I could try to reduce the poly counts by maybe just doing a quick, I'm not sure I'd use Dynamesh. The problem with Dynamesh is when you got all these separate objects that are technically part of one subtool. Did it save? Yeah, so ZBrush is great. It does give you Quicksave, so you can double click and open up a Z project from Quicksave. And I'll show you another kind of folder that has potential recovery files. So if you do have an unexpected crash and you haven't saved, is this it? Sort of. Well, let me just go back. I'll do the example with my, I'll make a custom brick. So I'll show you guys how to do that in a second. So yeah, let's go to a cube. Go to Initialize. So this is where I can control the sort of scale of things. So I'll make, I think, a 40 by 40, right? That's roughly brick sized. And to make this sculptable, editable, I'm going to go make PolyMesh 3D, and I might just go Dynamesh right away. Now Dynamesh, this gives me 30,000 polys. So remember, if this brick is going to be in your scene like dozens to potentially hundreds of times, you do want to try to keep it light and manageable, so you can do stuff like trim off the end bricks, like I just had an issue with. Those bricks were really heavy. From the inset, the IMM brick brush, I don't know how high the poly count is, but I just want to see if I split this, split unmasked points. Yeah, this one brick is 67,000 polys, which is way too much if you plan to repeat it dozens or hundreds of times. So this is why I'm going to build my own here. So I'm going to just take this guy, go the really low resolution, and Dynamesh it. not bad. So it gives me 500 polys. That's great for a brick. And if I want to chip away at it, I might just do a quick trim dynamic on this thing. So you may need a big enough brush size, by the way, for the trim to work. So I'm just going to quickly kind of knock back the edges, right? Give it a little bit of organic feeling wear and tear. Go with a little bit larger brush. There we go. Because most bricks do not come with perfectly sharp edges, right? So we want something that feels kind of real. I mean, that's kind of the artistry. You know, you can learn the technology as much as you want, but if you're not applying observational skills and art skills to your work, then one of my teachers used to say, you know, you're just basically a mouse jockey. Anybody can learn to move a mouse around in software, but you want to learn to be an artist, not just a technician. Okay, so, and I'm not doing this in symmetry either because I don't want perfectly repetitive, right, edges. I want a bit of that chaos, basically. Now, to make an insert brush, what you often have to do is rotate and snap to a view. So basically, if this is what I want the front side of the object to be, and this is where this will rest on the object, then I want to rotate, shift, snap to this view, and then go to the brush menu and say create insert mesh. So create insert mesh, and you can create new. Now it says append. Basically append means add. So I can make 20, 30, 40 variations of that brick and make my own multi-mesh, right? Insert multi-mesh, where I've got a bunch of varieties. In this case, I just want one. I'm just going to hit new. And if I go back to, I'll go back to maybe one of my earlier versions of this thing. I think this one should do. Okay, so this one, it has the high poly count as well. So I'm going to just, yeah, let's just reconstruct subdivisions so I can get out of this slow lagginess of the scene. Okay, let's dial it back. And when you go reconstruct subdivisions, each time you go lower and lower, it gets faster and faster, just because there's less geometry for it to calculate each time. Eventually, it'll hit a limit. You know, I probably could be able to get back to my lowest subdivision, which is my Maya blockout version. Oh, gotta wait. Yeah, if you get too click happy, which I often do, I'm probably the most impatient person, so I'm often like just jamming the button thinking it'll happen faster, but yeah, you guys have seen that error, I'm sure, at least once. Please wait, you know, ZBrush is doing something. Oftentimes if you just wait, it'll finish what it's actually supposed to do. There's always that like 20% of the time where it's actually going to crash. So, but that's the beauty of ZBrush too. I find is like even with all the crashes, it is still completely worth using. It's just so awesome. So again, I'll drag up my brick. By the way, so this is an error. I want to show you this. It says the mesh is composed of multiple subdivisions. Delete or freeze the subdivisions and try again. So this is why I deleted my lower subdivisions earlier. This is something that you new ZBrush people do a lot. You get this warning, or there's a button that says just like freeze, and you freeze, and then you forget to unfreeze. So what freezing does is it keeps the high poly detail, and it sort of temporarily stores it away, and it just gives you the low res version to work on, because certain functions don't work with high subdivisions. You have to remember, as soon as you're done whatever it is you're trying to do, so in this case I'm just trying to drag out a brick. So I hope that's, yeah, I'm going to switch the depth setting on this as well. So go brush, depth, and I'm going to set this quite far in, and then try to drag out a brick. Okay. So I really want to just get it fairly level as I can. So I feel like that sits decently into the model. So I'm going to just nudge this over because I want the midpoint roughly off the end here. I'm going to go to split unmask points. Now I need to make sure, remember this, geometry, go back and unfreeze, because what will happen is people, you know, a lot of new ZBrush artists, so they'll be like having to click freeze subdivisions and they don't think about it, they don't know what it's doing. So by unfreezing, it's actually bringing back the subdivisions and bringing back the high poly sculpting detail. If you fail to do that and try to do it later, you may get yourself into a serious jam where you've got almost like two versions that are almost in conflict with each other. And when you unfreeze, it'll create a disaster. I've got techniques around the disaster, so if you get into that situation, I can help. But try to make sure as soon as you're told to freeze that you at least get a vague understanding of what it's doing. It's keeping the lowest subdivision version of your model to do whatever function it's allowing you to do, and hiding the subdivisions that you have somewhere in a frozen state. So anyways, I'm going to have to let this recalculate everything, bring back the subdivisions. Again, I really wish I didn't divide this thing to 23.5 million polys, but unfortunately, due to the nature of the building, it kind of needed it. So, any day. All right, so yeah, after my little crash here. I wanted to mention one thing. So if you go to Lightbox, which we can get to by hitting the comma key, again, my ZBrush is being slowed due to this super heavy building. Come on, Lightbox, there we go. So yeah, you've got the Quicksave Palette, which is there if you have crashes. If you go to ZBrush, ZBrush, and I think it's called Recovered Files. Sometimes you can go in here and actually get some stuff back. So actually, I think this is my building here that I had earlier. There we go. So that can sometimes save your butt in a situation where you haven't saved in a while. Okay, so let me just go back to this. I guess I'll just start with a standard cube. I won't bother with the chiseling effect, but you guys get the idea on that. So let me just quickly make my insert brush again. Is it in the palette? I don't think it is. No. Do 40 by 40. Make polymesh, low resolution Dynamesh. Yeah, I guess that'll do for now. And then I'll just go brush. Oops. Again, snap our view. Brush creates insert mesh. New brush. By the way, if you have a brush you want to save, you can actually click on the brush and go save as. So the active brush, and you could say, you know, Matt's custom brick or whatever. So that's a way to save brushes as well. So yeah, let me go back to another cube just so we have something simple to work on. Make polymesh. Just scale this thing wider. So if I go to brush, right? Oops. Go back to draw, and then we'll just pretend this is like the mausoleum thing ahead. So I'll drag this thing out. Again, I think I need to go back to the depth, brush depth, set that in a little bit. So it's similar to the last example. So I'm just dragging this out, and then I'll just simply go to subtool, split, unmask points. Split, unmask points, grab the brick, and then I can do the array again, right? So I want to just quickly do the array. So I'll do my array mesh across, I guess, Z again. Okay, let's repeat that a little bit more. Yeah, ZBrush 2, you know, sometimes it's wonderful, but it's a little crazy at times. All right, so I'll do make mesh. So once I do one row, I'll go make mesh, hit array again, and then do a move down on this thing, and then an offset. Yeah, I think that's okay. Make mesh, array mesh, and then we'll, again, probably 6, 7 repeat is good. Move it down on Y. There we go. And then just increase the repeat again a bit and adjust the Y. Ooh, repeat is way too high. So I'll do, yeah, I guess 8 is a good amount. Yeah, sometimes it can be a little tough with ZBrush to dial in the exact amounts. Like I find that's one problem with ZBrush is the sliders are really, really touchy. Sometimes you do have to go to more manual, like data entry, basically. All right, let's just pretend this is good. So make mesh. And I'll do this outside of perspective. So I'll turn off perspective, and I'm going to solo the brick wall. Or maybe not solo, but I'll go to transparency mode. And then I'll go to B for brush, T for trim, right? Trim, curve. And I'll say OK. And then I will, let's see here. I'm going to just get just enough of this to cut off. So I might actually leave a thickness on the outside there. Right? So what's actually happening is the ends are kind of sliced off and the ends are filled. So that kind of saves me a bit of work, right? Which is nice. The reason I like to go lower res as well is that I can divide this. So if I divide once, maybe twice, now we're at 2 million polys very quickly on that side of the wall. And what's great about this though is that, you know, if you got something a little simpler, a little more even, you can still mess it up by going to the surface tool, go to noise. So I often like to go to a kind of large scale noise. So go really, really large scale. And you can play with the strength. You know, you don't want to go too high because it may completely warp the shape of things. But if I go with a large enough scale and strength, let's preview that, right? You see it roughs up the shape of each brick, so it becomes more organic feeling. Now again, this is only preview mode, so when you hit apply, it may look slightly different in the actual application. But check it out. All the bricks now have a little bit of different shape, right? So that's a way to kind of add randomness and layering. And then you can, of course, add custom brush strokes as well. You can move each brick. I'll show you another trick to this if you want to customize brick by brick, which some hardcore professionals would do. We can go to polygroups. Where do we go? Polygroups, and we can just go auto group. This might take a while, but each brick will then get assigned its own custom group. I should have watched this too. So this this is another one of those things. I've got enough polys. It's a high poly count, and if I'm doing auto groups, this may slow down the process a bit. But I'll come back and answer that question though in terms of insert. So you can not only do radial strokes or brush strokes around an object or around a cylinder or a column, but you can do inserts as well. So I'll show you guys a bit of that in a second. So there we go. Now you see each brick has its own custom color-coded group. So I can isolate each brick, right? So if I grab the move, scale, rotate like I showed you earlier, control tap on one brick. Now I can move it. I can move its shape around, right? I can warp it to wherever I need it to be. So polygroups are really, really useful for organizing mesh, for doing all sorts of stuff, right? When it comes to modeling. Let's go back to a cylinder so I can show you guys the insert cylinder. Yeah, I feel like a religious cult leader trying to get people to join the cult of ZBrush. So yeah, if we got a column, right, you can not only just go to transform, activate symmetry, and usually for a column like this it would be radial symmetry on Y. So we can do sculpting this way. That's actually the move brush. I can do clay tubes. Even in masking, so if I mask this, you know, you can mask, let's say I do mask with a drag, and I drag out a pattern like this. I may have to divide this to get the pattern to show up properly, but if I mask in symmetry, you see I can do that as well. Invert that, go to deformation. So this is a common combo that I use, and then we can inflate, right? Same thing if I go to brush, insert, let's go to these mechanical parts, let's say. Now keep in mind this thing has subdivisions, right? Remember what I said a bit earlier. It will tell you to freeze subdivisions. In this case, I find it safer and quicker. My mesh isn't over 4 or 5 million polys. Just to avoid freezing, I may just delete the lower subdivisions because, remember, I can actually reconstruct the subdivisions. So now, let me just hit M. This is a MultiMesh Insert. So let me pick something that's kind of visually interesting for this maybe. I'll do something that seems a little more decorative. Right, so I can do this, and I can drag in those parts, right? And if I wanted to, I could go to transform and maybe just, I'll triple the count. So let me get that, right? Now if I plan to do more sculpting and stuff, I may split them off into their own subtool just to kind of protect them. And if you're Dynameshing, by the way, Dynamesh will just merge the ever-loving crap out of all this. So I'll show you what happens. If I Dynamesh, anything that's near the surface will merge it into one surface. And you see it completely goes away. But even at a high resolution, when it's Dynameshing, it just looks for a way to merge the surfaces together. So if you want to kind of maintain the integrity of those little extra decorative elements, I would often split them into their own subtool. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah. It's a lot of little things to remember in ZBrush. So there's the Dynamesh version, right? So it's a continuous surface. So yeah, like I said, when I do an insert like this, I often like to protect it by saying split unmasked points, and then I can go continue to work on the base column. So, you know, other techniques which are great, clay tubes, and if I'm in, I could either do radial symmetry again, clay tubes, to get a little trim, but oftentimes if I want like an extrusion or something, if I'm at a high enough poly count, let me make sure I'll turn off my symmetry. I'll just use the regular mask, no alpha. So I can grab something through here, control click off the object, and then I can go to deformation, and I think I'm going to scale across the two kind of flat axes. So not the y-axis, so you've got the size modifier. I'll turn off the y, and if I do this, it'll just scale that out. Pretty sweet, right? So, yeah, basically, if I go reconstruct subdivisions, though, this might look a little weird, and you may have to change the mesh later on, but for the sculpted environments, you know, this sort of sculpting works totally fine. You can throw enough polys at it to kind of get what you want out of it. Yeah, let's try that. Reconstruct subdivisions, so I'll try that a couple times. So we can see how low we get this down to. Yeah. So yeah, at a certain point, these edges don't quite meet up, right? But anyway, so that's a little kind of crash course in a lot of different aspects that you may encounter in ZBrush. Anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, Mark.
Using that mask alpha, would that be the easiest way? Like, I'm trying to think, how would you like wrap a rope around that little pillar? Like, make an alpha of a rope?
Check this out. B for brush, I for insert. You've got what are called insert multi-mesh curves. I think I don't know if there is one built in. There's actually one that's a zipper. So when you literally click and drag, oh yeah, again, I got to freeze, right? So let me just go low. In this case, I'll delete higher. But that zipper, so there are rope brushes out there. And I don't know, maybe I could try to make one, but basically it's a curve brush. So even the brick that I had, right? If I have this brick, this insert mesh, I could try to turn it into a curve brush. So what does a curve brush do? Let me just undo this a little bit. We'll delete higher, delete lower. Okay. So when you create an insert mesh, you can go actually to stroke, curve, activate curve mode. And when you drag it out, it actually drags it out like a snaking tool.
Did you wrap that all the way around?
Oh, absolutely. So what happens is when you draw a curve, you can pull it along the surface after. You can extend the drawing out. So I'll pull it some more here. So yeah, it's a little tricky, but yeah, you can draw the line like this, and if you hover near it, you see the line wants to connect. Draw some more. Maybe nudge it a bit just to get it to follow the surface. Keep drawing. Get a little nudge just to get it to follow. So yeah, you can find or make your own rope brushes. The way this basically works is that you, let's say, I think I can try this maybe with a cylinder. I think I'll do that. I'll go make polymesh. I think if I go, yeah, let me snap to this view. I'm going to make, create insert mesh, new mesh. And then if I switch this to, again, stroke, activate curve mode. Let's go back to whatever I was working on, the column. Where is it? Here. Now it's doing this. So you can, in fact, kind of make, and I think if I affect, what is it, the curve step as well. It should make this a more solid line, basically. So you can actually build your own like small section of rope, turn it into that, or you can download them too. Like there's tons of them out there. Something else, this actually gets into the last point I wanted to make before I stop this, but there's a bunch of sites. I mentioned XMD on Gumroad, which is Michael Dunham. So for you future modelers, I highly recommend, as soon as his He has a lifetime membership. It's $50 US, but it goes on sale often for like 20, 25 bucks. And it's got everything. It's got all the different damage brushes. It's got all sorts of insert brushes, right, like vines and leaves. There's even like architectural kind of flourishes and stuff, which is great. A lot of studios and a lot of independent artists are using these kits, or this kit in particular. There's another site called badking.com.au from Australia. Free login. Most of the assets are free, so I've already downloaded one. There's a rubble pack. Now, I still want you guys to make your 5 core pieces of mesh for your scene, but if you need to populate the scene with extra stuff, these are basically big libraries. So I can show you what that looks like. I'll click on this, go to Load Brush. I believe that's in my downloads, rubble pack, ZBrush preset. So you see it's right here. And if I drag this out, there's, I don't know what that is. It's like a, looks like an oil drum lid. And if I hit M, there's tons of other stuff that people have made. So I can drag that into the scene, right? It's kind of amazing all the things you can do. This is like a dirt pile, I guess. There's a rubble pile that somebody put together, right? So you see how like one step adds to the next, right? Adding a couple of alphas, making a couple of custom inserts, or finding some can like drastically expand your productivity in modeling and in ZBrush. It's really phenomenal. So like I said, I think we could probably find a rope brush here. If I just search rope, I'm sure somebody's already made one. Maybe not. Or if we just ZBrush rope, yeah, ZBrush rope brush. Yeah, if you can't find one, you'll find a tutorial on how to make one. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of, oh, there is one actually on that site. So usually the way this works is you've got, you have to make 3 polygroups, a start, a middle, and an end. And that's how the tool knows how to, I think that's maybe the step I was missing with that basic cylinder I had. Let me just make sure this is polymesh. So yeah, if I just do like, oops, let me go to my select rectangle. So I'll isolate the top 3 levels, Control W, isolate the bottom 3, Control W. So now what it's saying is this top polygroup is the start point. The middle is the midpoint that's going to follow along the curve, and the end point is like the anchor. So I've often made like chains with anchor points. The zipper, for example, there's a start point to the zipper, which is that little clasping part. The mid part is the actual repeating pattern of the zipper, and the end point is the head of the zipper with the little thumb handle, right? So if I now go brush, it's funny, I never do it through here actually. Brush creates insert mesh. Make a new one, and let me go back to this thing I was doing. So if I clear the mask on this, and then I switch it, right, stroke, curve mode, click and drag. Yeah, it's still coming out broken. I've noticed this too. I've had this issue a few times, but I have to figure out why that's happening. But yeah, but normally it doesn't do that. So there's something wrong, I think, with the preset in ZBrush. I have to jog my memory on this too. It's been a while since I've made an insert curve. But yeah, normally it would kind of come out fairly seamless. But like I said, this other brush, if I download it, so I've got my account, right? You basically have to add to cart. Virtually everything on the site is free. So I'm going to go add to cart. And I'll show you what the rope brush looks like. So let's say we go to cart. And then we'll, oops, I just need one of these. Update cart. And then I'll just go to checkout. Once that's done, I'm going to have to donate soon because I've been using this site a fair bit. So it's only right to give them a bit of cash. Because yeah, they've really got a ton of really great insert brushes that are just ready to go, you know. So I'll download that, I'm going to unzip it, and then I'll show you what that rope looks like. And hopefully you guys will appreciate that. But all right, so rope brush, go back to ZBrush, go to load brush, and we'll open up the rope. There you go. So like I said, while you're drawing curves, especially if you're going around and around a cylinder, you often have to kind of draw it from a view you can see. And you notice if you get near the end or the start point, a line will sort of connect to the brush. That's telling you can extend the stroke, like so, right? So Mark, you're probably regretting having to do all that rope stuff in Maya now, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the genius and beauty of ZBrush. It's just, it's the way it should be, basically. Pretty awesome though, right? And what's cool about this is you can pull it off, you can drag it, right? So you can.
How would you tie a knot?
Don't even ask. I don't even want to think about it. You know what I'd probably do is
I tried doing it in Maya.
Yeah, and modeling knots, what you often do is you make little curves of like a C-shaped curve of the rope, and then you just rotate it into different positions and warp it. Honestly, that's like the quickest way to do it, is make it look like a real knot from the surface level, right? Anyways, that's finally wrapping it up. A little crash course into all the little things that you may want to look at when you're sculpting these environments. So this will be posted on YouTube and Moodle, and you guys will have access to that like in 10 minutes.